This whole process of MAiD takes time. And if you're doing it right, you don't direct it, the patient's directing.
Welcome to The Last Doctors, a new podcast series of the Voices of the Completed Life, where we will share conversations with physicians who listen to, advise, and care for patients in the last chapters of their lives. Sometimes these doctors offer what is called palliative care, hospice services, or medical assistance in dying. Dr. Jean Marmoreo, a physician and author in Canada, has helpfully called these remarkable people our last doctors, which is also the title of her moving book, a book in which I underlined paragraphs, a book that I highly recommend to anyone who thinks deeply about a good life and a good death, a book that is the inspiration for this podcast series. My name is Lynn Barger-Elliott, executive producer of Completed Life Podcasts, and today it is my privilege to talk with Dr. Jean Marmoreo, who describes herself as a doctor, writer, athlete, advocate, and adventurer. In 2005, Dr. Marmoreo was chosen as one of the 100 most powerful women in Canada. And of course, there are many ways in which to define and even interpret power. One way is Jean's 45-year career as a family practice physician, in which she delivered, on average, 300 babies a year, and at times for 48 hours straight. Her strength and resolve is also evidenced as an elite marathoner, having qualified for the prestigious Boston Marathon 9 times. In 8 different years, she placed first in her age group, and in 2013, her time set a course record for her age group. Jean is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and has hiked 1,000 miles of the Appalachian Trail. Today, I am so honored that Dr. Marmoreo has joined me for this podcast conversation to discuss her book, The Last Doctor: Lessons in Living from the Front Lines of Medical Assistance in Dying, published in 2022. It is in these pages that she tells the stories of 7 brave and determined patients who requested to die on their own terms. She also shares the decision that led her at the age of 74 to change her medical subspecialty, or in the words of her husband Bob Ramsey, to change from delivering babies to delivering people to another world, proving that it's never too late to set off in a new direction. Welcome, Dr. Marmoreo, to The Last Doctors, a Completed Life podcast. In the book written by your husband, Bob Ramsey, Love or Die Trying, about your 30 years together, which I came across and so enjoyed reading, he quotes the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward." So I'd like to go backwards first, if I may, and then move forward. You're a marathon runner. You've trekked through Nepal and hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. Your husband writes that your relationship was forged over 8 weeks and 800 miles on the Appalachian Trail. He described the beginning of your relationship this way: "Our muscles ached all the time. Our feet were blistered. Our faces burned. We fell asleep the second our heads hit our sleeping bags. but we never felt so alive or united. And most of all, I got a real sense of just how willful the woman I was hiking with could be. While many physicians at your stage of life were enjoying retirement in warmer climates, you continued to practice medicine into a sixth decade. Can you speak to this quality of endurance, this will in your life and as your work as a physician?
Yeah, because I think it is basically a nod to your upbringing. Uh, and when I sit with people who talk to me about their lives lived, their completed lives lived, it always comes back to how you were raised and who raised you. Um, and it's simplistic to say, you learn from your mother's knee. I'm a girl, so I think the expectation is I would learn from my mother's knee. The nurturing part, for sure, but the backbone, the stiffness in your backbone, came right from my father, whose image and expectation and rigor and duty, um, you know, became sort of inbred and is in my bones. And he was the kind of man, a hard man. Grew up sort of hard scrabble for sure. Um, Basically, I think everything that he lived his life was instilled in me, diluted, instilled, and kind of dropped into my DNA and my bones. So, um, and still, I mean, I'm over 80 now, and I still, can't shake the fact that if you are not working, if you can work and you can give value, you should be. You have to earn your rest. You have to earn your privilege to kind of sit back and read books, or you have to earn your rest to kind of take on an active activity. We were farmers. So the notion that you would look at a field and not walk around and pull out the weeds, it's not there. And it's a model for me about living too. But it's a model I see reflected in so many people that I interview who want to have that control at the end of their lives. It is kind of what is purpose, and what gives you value, and what makes you feel you have had that completed life.
Thank you. The way you speak about your work, your practice as a medical assistance and dying provider, in many ways sounds like a calling. Can you tell us how, at the age of 74, you made that discovery?
It wasn't a discovery. Um, it was an obligation. And it really is about the 45 years I was in practice, looking after patients who very, very cognizant and finely tunedly aware of the criminal implications of helping somebody die, I would just retire. They would just leave me. They would retreat from the practice. I knew enough about what was going on to know what they were doing. And because they didn't want to involve me, they also didn't want to involve family members. So it was the most painful, secretive process for somebody who was kind of suffering. These would not be people who, had reached what they considered the end of their life, their completed life, and wanted kind of mastery of the end. These would be people who were suffering. They were people with breast cancer, people with colon cancer, people who basically were facing a sort of a long, slow, painful decline. And they were also people who I would say had, university education. We looked after a downtown Toronto practice, very kind of, university graduated, self-directed, knowledgeable base of people. And they would kind of come and they would signal in the office that would be their last visit. And I knew exactly what they were aiming to do. And I also knew they had the means to kind of, contact, Hemlock Society. But they would never speak to that with me, because it was kind of the silent communication. Don't do it, because I had obligations not to kind of, step in and assist. So I just felt that they were abandoned, by me, by sort of the system, And it's just, repeated, that repeated experience over and over again of seeing people isolated and left on their own to kind of find their own way that kind of fashioned what was kind of an instant heartfelt obligation to change that circumstance for people if I could. And my notion was that family doctors should be able and would want to do this for their practice, for their patient population. And that has shifted. And I'm a bit sad about that because the whole of medicine has shifted. Partly COVID did this to us. It got us this lovely Zoom, this lovely
Yeah.
class as it dragged medicine into the 21st century in terms of communication. But it has also kind of changed the nature of the relationship now, I think, between physicians and patients, where you can do so much more so expediently. People don't have to sit and wait for you for hours, but you kind of lose that thread of being able to sort of sit with a patient in the office and give them the 30 minutes so that they can get finally in the last 5 minutes of your appointment to the thing that's really bothering them, And when you do that for 45 years, you really sense, you haven't got it yet, you haven't heard it yet. But it takes that knowledge base and experience with each of your patients to kind of know how do they speak to you, when they don't speak to you, what are they not saying that they can't say, and it's a fine-tuned metronome of kind of this is the one that counts. This is the one that's going to get to the conversation that counts, and it takes time and patience to get there. And we're losing that. We've gotten terribly efficient with our 15 minutes appointment. I can do this all on Zoom. Don't bother coming into the office. So things have shifted, and even clinicians who have looked after patients for sort of 25 and 35 years, they call me up and they say, my patient wants a medically assisted death. Can you see them? And I say, well, I'm happy to do this procedure with you, and then you can look after everybody in your own practice. That's what I thought would happen. No. I think physicians, for the most part, are too busy trying to kind of scramble to look after everybody. And this whole process of MAiD takes time. And if you're doing it right, you don't direct it, the patient's directing. They're directing their kind of when they want it, how they want it, who they want in there. And these are long discussions. You can sort of set it up. They say, well, what do I need to do? And I say, well, there's no rule book here. You will create your own template. You will create your own sort of script here about who you want and how you want it.
I was struck by 3 different comments that you made in the book describing medical assistants in dying, or what is commonly referred to as MAiD. I'd like to read them and ask if you would share what led you to make these observations. The first is, you write, that's the thing about MAiD. It's the one reason I can go on providing it. MAiD takes away someone's life, but first it gives it back to them. Can you say more about what you mean about giving back someone's life?
I think it's the process of recall. When you're doing an assessment, you have to understand the cause of suffering. Basically, one of the principal criteria for providing MAiD in Canada is that you have an advanced disease, illness, or disability, and that it is causing you grievous and irremediable suffering. So when we go in to start an assessment, what we're assessing is the suffering, their meaning of the suffering, and what it has done to their lives, and what is the nature of the decline, because it must be an irreversible decline in capacity. These are the legal criteria that we work under and answer to. So the course of kind of discovering that is always related to the life that they have lived, and what in that life has now changed to create and cause the grievous and irremediable suffering. And most people will certainly describe the disease, illness, or disability. But that's really not the foundation of why they're asking for an assisted death. It is that they have lost the meaning of their life, or that their life has changed in a way that they know they cannot get it back again. Cancer is the obvious one, of course. But people in advanced kidney disease or on dialysis, people who have congestive heart failure and are sort of struggling to kind of get through every single day. People with neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, I put into this category as well. People who know they're losing capacity, who know they're losing the ability to reason, and that is the cause of their suffering. But you always come back to, well, when were you well? And what has your life been? And what is your life? What is your life's meaning? So almost invariably, people will go to their parents, go to their grandparents, go to the whole process of immigration. Like Canada, like America, is really a young country. We don't have these tremendous, 500, 600-year-old kind of repetitious roots. We have immigrant stories. We have stories of hardship. We have stories of hardship and success and kind of legacies, that have gone on for sort of 2 or 3 generations, but that's it. It's 2 or 3 generations. So you hear wonderful stories about the roots. I mean, I think that's my great love, is to kind of understand the roots, So I think it's always that process of going back to who are the people they are, who made them what they are, who gave them their values, who gave them their purpose in living, and what is their legacy going forward to their children and their grandchildren, because everybody's got them too, and they say I don't want to involve anybody. And so I always have to kind of start by saying, this is not about you. I mean, it is about you, but at some point it isn't. It's about who is around you, who is there to support you. No, I don't want to trouble them. I think I say in the book, talking about Joe, his 92-year-old aunt, very, very strict and devout Roman Catholic. She would never be able to kind of tolerate what he was doing. He knew that. He knew it like, sort of, the baptismal card. But at his provision, there she was, a 92-year-old, very, very staunch Roman Catholic aunt. And I talked to her after, because I said it was so important for him, for Joe, to know that his aunt was there. I mean, there were many other people there too, but you could pull it out. You could basically say, this is the woman who mattered for him to be there.
Yeah. It's amazing that she knew that and could do that.
Yeah, that happens over and over. I mean, there's always family stories here, There's always the unfinished business. There's always the kind of old resentments that kind of, they come out. they come out as people are talking about, I've got a brother I haven't spoken to in 5 years. He will never kind of be interested in this. And then, you come back a couple of weeks later and lo and behold, the brother's been there and, they've sorted out stuff. Because when if you don't sort it out now, it'll linger. And it lingers in the people who are left. It doesn't linger in the people I have helped die. They're gone. It lingers in the people who are left who did not finish business, say what they had to say, and move on,
You also wrote end of life issues, I quickly learned, are whole life issues. Can you say more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, that's kind of the point of what you have not finished, what the resentments that you have left, that you are carrying, we talk about this all the time, forgive, because if you don't, you're carrying an emotion that is basically taking away all the other emotions that kind of give you a push forward. Maybe that's the foundation for so many belief systems in the world. It doesn't really matter whether you frame them in kind of a religious context or frame them in kind of the soul and its meaning. I mean, I think every philosophy of life will carry, if you don't relieve yourself of the burden of guilt, the burden of anger, the burden of shame, all of that, you don't have room for those sort of really positive things that can kind of propel you forward. If in fact you're the kind of human being who wants hope, who wants sort of value and purpose and connection, human to human connection that is valued and trustworthy, that you can count on, that you can reach out and know it's there for you. So it's a tremendous emotion without words, but it can be so cut down if there is kind of resentment and anger and blame. All those emotions that we live with all the time, So to have the opportunity to say, your family needs to tell you things. And I've sat with, where 32 people have assembled around the matriarch, and it always comes down to the same thing. It's just, no matter how it's couched, it is always about look after one another, take care of yourself. I have given you the best I could, and I let you carry it forward. But it is always in the framework of look after yourselves, look after each other, which is a care, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, on the basis of your whole life lived, no matter what the roots are, no matter what the story is, I think everybody who sort of basically says, I have this in my hand, I have mastery and control of how I go out and the message I leave behind. The message is always kind of in the same framework of look after yourself, take care of each other. It is so profoundly simple, and it comes again and again from people who are basically down to their last few words, and that's what comes out.
It's beautiful. You refer to the soul at times in your book. For example, you wrote, to help someone die, to do it well, I needed to dive deep into a patient's motivations, to listen for their soul. And again, you write, the most common reasons to consider requesting MAiD are the loss of the ability to engage in meaningful activities, in the anticipation of pain and suffering. A patient can't stand the idea that they will need people, likely strangers, to feed them, dress them, and clean them up. They may also be afraid, depending on their illness, that they'll lose their memories and that they won't know their loved ones, that they'll become a shell of a soul with no quality of life, that they will no longer be themselves, and that is something that doctors cannot cure. Soul is a word that elicits different responses. It has different interpretations. What does that word mean for you as you work to care for your patients?
Yeah, it became an expansion of kind of how people identify themselves, and how, as a physician, and you're kind of assessing their eligibility criteria, why they're what is suffering to them, what is life, what is the meaning of life to them. These are not big global concepts for people who I sit and talk with. So they don't frame it in the religious sense of that word. God gave me my soul, my soul returns. It isn't that. It is about how they live their life. It's their identity. It's who they are. And once you sort of frame it in a much broader context, the word I came to was soul. What is the profound and core meaning of life to this person? And that's why soul became so important for me. And when I apply that word to myself, basically I had to kind of start wrapping up all the things I had parsed off. I had put in silos. I mean, this terrible tension of, am I doing the right thing? Have we done enough? Is this really important that I provide this person a way out? That I am the agent of death here. That I'm the person carrying in the needles. I will end a life. I will take a life that is being lived here. So there's moral conflict at the base. there is sensibility. There's always kind of your own biases about sort of what is value of life. So that recognition, that parsing about all of these contexts of why people are asking for help to die, I mean, it's based in human rights. It's based in the Charter of, Rights and Freedoms in Canada. Um, but basically, the person who's involved in taking that life has got an interaction here too. And, we are totally, profoundly interlinked in this transactional, communication. And I had to kind of put my soul in there as well. I had to say, it's not just how efficient are you and how good a historian and how good a record keeper are you, and have you got all? Can you check all the boxes? This is going to amount to inability to feed yourself, have to be changed, depending on other people. All of those criteria, the 12, 15, or whatever. It's way more than that. It is who are you and who am I in this transaction of ending your life. So soul is a much broader concept because it's got values in it. It's got faith in it. I said, you can never, and I run into this over and over and over again, even in the course of talking to somebody about controlling the end of the life. You have to position hope in there. People always hope to live. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And when you're talking to somebody who's at the point where they are letting go of hope, exchanging hope of living to control the dying, it's a very, very different direction that people are heading down. Most people have given tremendous thought to it intellectually ahead of time. This is why everybody wants an advance request. I don't want to be that shell without the soul. I don't want to be an unidentifiable person in my own mind and in my own being. But it is different when you move from thinking about it intellectually, being in control of the end of my life, to recognizing and realizing that you are now on a track that sets a date that will end your life because you let go of hope. Let go of hope and exchange it for mastery. So these are really intense conversations, and I think it is our job as assessors for people who are in this process to kind of know if in fact they do need to sit down with somebody who is faith-based, of their own faith, to kind of have the opportunity to say, where am I? Where am I in terms of what the Catholic faith has taught me from fore on? Where am I, as a Muslim practitioner? Where am I as a practicing, Jewish person? Where am I as a Buddhist?
Well, all those concepts, there's no small talk there, as they say, but thinking about hope and purpose and ending and life and soul, all those, I could imagine, had you never spoken to some kind of spiritual advisor, those are spiritual issues that would bring you to that point, that it would be helpful to talk to somebody who is maybe more experienced or more articulate in those topics, just because they all come together in a pretty short section of your life. I mean, they're always there, but I would think that you ponder them a little deeper.
Well, yeah. I think when you're kind of close to death, it all surfaces again, even if you have not been, practicing in any faith your whole life. You come from families of faith for the most part. We all the immigrant families here have, sort of deep roots in sort of, Protestantism. The Catholic faith has, spread worldwide. There are deep roots in Catholicism. And it's amazing because we get really wrapped up in it now. And, Toronto is probably the most culturally diverse, city in Canada, in the world right now. So we're much more tuned into here in terms of how to kind of address these, and much more comfortable sort of saying, is there kind of, any faith-based organization that you are affixed to or attached to? Is there anybody who would be helpful for you? Especially when we can see pain, when we can see a lot of pain around the choice, and sort of knowing that it will run so against the grain of everybody else in the family. We really work much harder to kind of find pathways through that for them, for people who we know have got lots of conflict in that area. And again, you do your assessment in sort of an hour and a half. That kind of opens these doors. It doesn't close them; it opens them in terms of sort of trying to help people really sit down with the right person, if I can say that. So basically, through the years, you kind of learn who's going to be the best person for that conversation. But these are conversations. These are, from my perspective, valuable, insightful,
Sure.
necessary conversations about how do people reach out and how do you care? Because that's really where it all comes down to, is how do you care? And I would say that for people who basically say they're asking for MAiD because they have got really no social context and they are being sort of sidelined and racialized and marginalized and all the words. It's always comes back to, well, how do you find the right care, people? Because I personally would never sort of offer MAiD as an answer for social injustice or sort of lack of resource. It requires that you find those resources. I mean, it's different context, isn't it?
Right.
So
At a pivotal and poignant part of the book, you had the realization that you were the queen of backpacks.
oh yeah.
You're a hiker and have carried backpacks across the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide in Montana. Instead of a black leather bag that we stereotypically imagine doctors carrying, you carry a backpack with your supplies. You refer to the backpack as the cornerstone of your marriage, a present to yourself on your 50th birthday when you and Bob spent 3 months hiking the Appalachian Trail as you hauled a 50-pound pack over thousands of miles. As you packed up your home for a recent move, you counted 27 backpacks.
True. My husband didn't believe we had 27.
I believe you. Yeah. One needs a variety. Of course, these life companions are reminders of where we've been. They carry memories as well as supplies for our journeys, but they can also weigh us down. They reveal our inclination to carry too much, even to the point of excess. The backpack for you has become a symbol of self-care as a person and as a MAiD provider. Can you talk about that in the past, so to speak, and tell us what you're carrying in your backpack today and what you might carry in the future?
Well, the future is pretty easy because I haven't got much of a future ahead. even if I sort of look at the road. Now everything I think about going ahead is you better lighten that load because you're limited in terms of what you can carry and how much time you've got to carry it anyway. I think carrying my MAiD equipment in my backpack is when you get your drugs to kind of go and do a provision, they come in a great big fishing tackle box. And when I started doing MAiD work, I said I will go wherever in the city the TTC goes, the public transportation system. Because if I can go there, then I know the city is being well served. But I will not get in a car and drive and sit in traffic for an hour and a half to get to somebody's home. So I said the TTC and me are it. Where the TTC goes, I will go. And I have been able to hold that pretty well continuously. There have been maybe one or two times when I had to actually get out of the TTC system, but it has been kind of in my head that this is to serve the population of Toronto, this service in the community. That's because I'm a community physician doing this. And if the public transportation system doesn't get me there, it's not a working service. So you get this great big fishing tackle box that comes delivered to my home. And there's no way I can get on the TTC with that. I mean, it would take 4 seconds for people to realize I'm carrying some really big drugs in that bag. So the backpack is obvious, way to carry it, but it's also very comfortable for me. to carry, a backpack. So it just fell in. This was not a problem. But shedding all the stuff you don't need in that backpack was not so much the issue for me, but putting in the backpack the things that really mattered. And this also came out of almost burning out doing this work. Carrying so much, so much of the kind of questions that you can't answer, and the burden of sort of knowing, is this right or is this not right? Or am I doing a good thing or a bad thing? The kind of questions that there would never be an answer for. And you've just got to kind of know that your shoulders are broad enough, or your faith base is big enough, or that your principles are strong enough to kind of carry, or that you can simply carry the doubt with you. And one of the things that I learned in that process of almost burning out was that, and principles of self-care here, like know who you are, and know what you need to do to kind of restore yourself, know what you need to do to refresh, hit the refresh button here, Jean, so it was this notion that came from Sir Andrea Frolick, the psychologist, who basically said, you hang on to the things you know have terrific meaning for you. So that came my imperfect half bowl, because I started turning wood, and I will spend hours and hours and hours to try and turn out a half-inch bowl with a kind of a used lid from another bowl that I cracked, but you won't believe what I do. It's nothing fun to witness, but I had turned a perfect bowl and cracked the lid. And what I carry in my backpack is the half-cracked bowl, because it lets you know it's not perfection here. It's something you can hang on to and touch and have comfort in, but it's not perfect. And that that's okay, because nothing in your life is going to be really perfect, And that was the other thing about gathering poems, important sayings, things that kind of really reflected. And this is where Mary Oliver's Wild Geese comes in, and why it became the first page of the book on sort of wild geese. You have to know where you are. What is your place in the universe? Because it's so much beyond you, that you are so little in the great scheme of things, that remember your place in the universe, and then you won't get undone by thinking the universe is going to rise and fall on you. So it's what I now put in the backpack that has much more meaning, and it's the backpack as symbol now. And I realized that it's a short step to go from the backpack of survival to the backpack of survival, in the broadest sense of the word.
A short step. That's beautiful to remember too as we pack. Yeah, thank you. One person in your book that I kept returning to is Sheila. In an interview I watched, you referred to her life, her treatment, her story as unfinished business. And you started to talk about this a little bit earlier, but can you tell us about dementia and MAiD, and maybe a bit more about where the law is in Canada right now?
Yeah. Moving. It's interesting, I think, and this is basically the entire MAiD community across Canada, because we started an organization called CAMAP, the Canadian Association of Medical Assistant Providers and Assessors. And when we started this, it was very much a grassroots, and it became kind of an online, nationwide grassroots organization of physicians, who basically came into place to support each other, and then came and grew, as an organization that basically set some of the clinical practice guidelines, set some of the means to support one another, both as providers. Providers have a very private form that is secure. So basically, the big dilemmas, the big questions, I'm not sure of where I should stand with this patient, became even more critical when the legislation passed that said natural death being reasonably foreseeable was basically counter to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and so people could now request MAiD who did not have a naturally foreseeable natural death. And these are highly complex cases. They require much more investigation, much more drawing in of resources. Not that it didn't before, believe me, it did. But now, in fact, it became legislation. So now there were, in fact, pretty rigorous safeguards and regulations that basically had to be met in order for a person whose natural death isn't reasonably foreseeable to be permitted to have an assisted death. And people were very afraid, of course, that that would then begin to take in the great swell of people who didn't have social resources, did not have adequate, sort of backup support. And that was the sort of great fear that basically, assisted dying would be offered to them as a means to kind of end their life, as opposed to kind of work to kind of keep them living reasonably with the supports that they needed to be able to kind of have a full life and a wholesome life and a valued life. Valued is the operative word. But the organization itself is now responsible for a huge curriculum around all of these issues, complex cases, Alzheimer's decline. When, what is a waiver of final consent? How long can it be used? How long can it be in play for somebody who has cognitive decline and wants to set a future date down the road in case they lose capacity? So all of the issues about, well, what would make somebody lose capacity? How does it fit into the whole scheme of things of somebody who's saying, I want to secure the end of my life, but I am dementing, I have cognitive decline, or I have a neurodegenerative condition that will lead me forward to a place that I know I then wanted, but I'm not there yet. So all of these are huge, complex issues that people are weighing up very carefully about how do we secure people in sort of what they want, and still kind of meet the legislative requirements. So how we are doing that, of course, is by basically via the form, by a clinical practice guideline, by setting kind of a standard of practice amongst ourselves across Canada, not just, how is it working in your, down at the end of Toronto, but across Canada, so that people are comfortable and supported as we kind of walk people through everything that they need to have in place when we know that they don't have either a natural death being reasonably foreseeable, or we are afraid that they will lose capacity before they have that date set. So these are the kinds of issues that basically kind of are now floating through the universe and through Canada. But I think probably almost everywhere else that is going to actually consider this kind of legislation, it'll all come up. These are all the issues that will come up. And when you sort of think about sort of the standards, I mean, some of the states in America have a 6-month prognosis. If you're not going to die within 6 months, you're not ever going to be eligible. And in Canada, we are kind of looking at, well, what would you consider a trajectory to death? So when I started doing this work, I think the youngest person I provided for was 28 years of age. She had a trajectory towards death, and when I talked with her neurologist, and he was a developmental neuroneurologist, I said, where do you think she is on the trajectory? And he said, oh, well, 75%. That was all I needed. I said, that is a reasonable trajectory to death. She's eligible. But people were alarmed at that point and did not feel that they could ever say a 28-year-old, had a trajectory to death. That would basically say, you haven't defined it. And in fact, what he was really saying is she wasn't going to die. He was saying she would be vegetative. She would not know where she was. She would not be able to move. She would not recognize anybody, but she would still be alive. Well, 10 years ago, if you tried to kind of say this person needs an assisted death, you would be charged criminally. So we've come a long way in terms of how we can apply the law as it is laid out to also providing the kind of compassionate care that people need when they say, I know what my end looks like, and I don't want that for myself, as this 28-year-old did.
Thank you.
And it has to be kind of all put together. It has to all make sense, not just in terms of, okay, I can't climb a flight of stairs, but what does that mean? Does that mean you need care? Does that mean that you are not able to kind of move to a single flat apartment? Does that mean that there is really no one to assist you? Does that mean that we can't actually bring in services that kind of can help you with sort of care needs? And does that mean, if personal care means bringing in a stranger, that that's acceptable to you or not? So, I mean, so it's all of these issues, and that's why simply saying, you meet the criteria of the law, but it has to be relevant to the life of that person that you're assessing. And you have to determine suffering. And we, as we said right from the very beginning, we don't walk in there with suffer meters. We don't say, oh, sorry, but you're not at 9 out of 12, so you're not going to qualify. It is a subjective feeling. And Canada is unique in the sense that in Canada, the issue of suffering is not my decision. The issue of suffering is basically the patient's. If the patient says to me, I am suffering because of this, they are. I don't question that. As opposed to some other jurisdictions, like in Holland, some of the issues around having assisted death, especially around depression, because Holland has had this door opener for a while. The issue of suffering is a decision jointly made between the patient and the physician assessor. And that's in Holland. So in Holland, you can't simply say, I have chronic depression and I am suffering as a result of this, and it's accepted. It's a conjoint decision. Canada is not like that. Canada says your suffering is your suffering. I accept that criteria. I don't challenge that. So it's a different perspective, but it just means that your obligation to understand suffering in the context of that person's life becomes much more critical.
That's where you read the soul. You listen for the soul, which takes time.
It may take more than, 1 or 2 sessions. I think when we started to write this book and we had to go back, because I picked these patients because they had lessons for me. But after 5 years, we had to contact all the families and we had to get their permission, because I said, I don't want to use pseudonyms here. But going back and talking to all the families, going back and sort of, 5 years on, the legacy of that person's death in the family was astounding. It was astounding in terms of sort of the value that the families had taken from it. It was astounding in terms of the way they could honor the memory. It was clean, it was like you didn't have regret. It was the most amazing thing to not feel regret, but to kind of feel the joy of what they had been able to provide for the family in terms of the memory moving on. It was really, really touching, and incredibly real, because visibly real.
Right. There's some clarity on what mattered to that person, and really the ability, the agency to offer that as an inheritance, if you will, but what you've passed on, and the ability to make crystal clear to your children and grandchildren that just what you cared about, what was meaningful and important to you.
Yeah, it's interesting because it removed the suffering. It removed the suffering away, and I think that is totally because it was, when you leave somebody in control of their end, you give them, this is part of giving their life back. You give them back their dignity. You give them back their capacity to make choice. You give them back, and for their families to sort of see that they have control again, that they are not kind of being sort of swept away by this illness or this disease, or being sort of left, half empty. They resume fullness in a funny kind of way.
I was struck by the way you subtitled your book, Lessons in Living, from the front lines of medical assistance in dying. At the Completed Life Initiative, we believe that one can learn how to live purposefully, meaningfully, completely by being aware of one's death. And I was struck in particular that you learned and shared this lesson. You wrote, "One thing you can count on if you provide MAiD, you will see the best and the worst of human nature. You will see families with unfinished business, with resentments both simmering and boiling over. You will see immediately which child is loved the most, which one feels most overlooked. Despite all that, MAiD can bring families together in a way that waiting out an unpredictable natural death cannot." That's lesson 4. MAiD can be beautiful. Is it possible to say that MAiD helps a person, even a family, complete a life?
Oh, I think so. And again, when people are sort of directing the end of their life, what they're leaving off, what they're leaving behind, is a dependence on a medical care system, and we are ingrained in that and embedded in it now. I think when we turned the care of our families over to the care of strangers, we moved down a very different course. It's a very medicalized course. It's a very sterile. It's a very, until the very last minute, there's something more we can do, or something we should do. And I think when you're in a hospital situation, there's an obligation to push and push and push and try one more thing. And the more that happens, the less and less and less the person lying in that bed, has any control of anything. The more passive they become, the more fragile they become, the more dependent they become on a system that is kind of incredibly routinized, organized, medicalized. And that leaves everybody in a very passive position, not only the patient lying in the bed, but the family members. I mean, there are very few family members who at end of life will march down the hall and pull a Shirley MacLaine, like, and sort of say, "You must do something." Very, very few families can ever really do that. They can try and seek out a nurse and say, where do we stand? What do we need to know here? Who's seeing my dad? Is the doctor coming today? Can I talk with anybody? Everybody becomes incredibly passive. Everyone loses some pretty basic, profound initiative care that you would do at home. You would never sort of leave somebody sort of needing a diaper that needs to be changed, or basically saying they're having distress. Do I put an oxygen mask on them? Do I sit them up? What the hell do I do with them? So to remove that, to take that dependency and passivity away, and give person grace to say, I want this, and I'm in control of it. And they may be gasping for breath, but they are controlling that scene. They are basically there, and you can see it. You can sort of see who's crying and who's angry and who can't stand it, and they sort of say, if you need to go, go. Because family members know family members, and they know who's up and who's down and who's in and who's out. They know the auntie in the outside room who's kind of pacing and swearing and sort of saying, "I'm not going to get what I deserve here. I should." You see all of that, and you know all of that. And I stay so focused on who's in the bed or who's sitting in the couch, because that's my job. But I assume that the family that's all there, have got their own webs. they've all got their own webs, but in that moment they're intertwined. They're all there to basically sort of witness something that basically somebody has taken control of, their family. And because they've done that, the family can do the same. They can say, we need to do this. We need to do the right thing. We need to do the honorable thing. And when you kind of bring people together, and suddenly all of those small nitpicking arguments, the sniping, it can all fade. It can all go away, because they're not there to kind of justify their anger or justify their resentment. They're there to honor a parent, an aunt, a child. It becomes that obvious in the moment. It may not stay afterwards, but in the moment it brings people together. and it gives them a chance to sort of look at it differently because they're all there to do the same thing.
And that's beautiful. Beautiful work.
Yeah, it keeps me going. It keeps me going.
Thank you for joining us for the first episode of The Last Doctors. I'd also like to thank Zoe Wilshire, the editor of Completed Life podcast. Please know that during our conversation, Dr. Marmoreo informed us that her book, The Last Doctor, has recently been made available in paperback. We encourage you to pick up a copy of this important reflection on the work of a last doctor. And please join us next week as I interview Dr. Ntizimira, a palliative care physician from Rwanda and author of The Safari Concept, an African framework for end-of-life care. You can find other episodes of Voices of the Completed Life, as well as other podcast series, Gifts of the Completed Life, and Lexicon of Life and Death, on your favorite podcast platform, or visit our website, completedlife.org, and go to the Programs tab and scroll down. Thank you for joining us here at the Completed Life Initiative. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your reflections, comments, or your stories of the completed life by emailing us at info@completedlife.org.